I want to share a very cool book with you called Lillian's Right to Vote. So we are just about to have an election day in our country. And every year in November, we have election day and we get to vote on all kinds of things, right? So sometimes we're voting for president, sometimes we're voting for senators or Congress people. Sometimes we're just voting for different laws around our community, around our state. Sometimes we're voting for things that affect our school or our roads or other things around our community. And you may talk to your parents some about what they're voting and how they're voting, but it wasn't always the case that everyone in our country had the right to vote. So I know that you don't have, right? You have to be 18 now to vote. However, not everyone used to have the right to vote and haven't had for a long time. And so I want to make sure that you understand that for some people, even though sometimes we think about, oh, we don't need to vote, there's nothing that important going on. Not everybody had that chance all the time. And this is a story about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and how important that Voting Rights Act was in changing who had access to voting in the United States. And this woman's story, Lillian's right to vote. Okay. Here we go. A very old woman stands at the bottom of a very steep hill. It's voting day. She's an American and she is going to vote. Lillian is her name. It is a long haul up that steep hill. It's a long haul when you've been alive for 100 years. Whoa, 100 years. It's a long haul when you've lived the life that Lillian has and walked so far in her shoes. When Lillian looks up, it's more than the blue sky she sees. She sees history. Lillian sees her great-great-grandparents, Elijah and Sarah. They are standing side by side on an auction block. Sarah is holding their baby Edmund. They are being sold as slaves in front of the very same Alabama courthouse where rich white men and no one else are allowed to vote. Okay, so she's thinking about when our country was first established, only certain people could vote. And so she's thinking about her great-great-grandparents who were sold as slaves while other people were allowed to vote. Lillian starts her slow climb. She must be walking to where she's voting, right? Right now we have where we can drive and drop off our ballots, but a lot of people walk to places or go to buildings like schools or government offices where they can go vote. So Lillian is walking to where she's voting. Lillian starts her slow climb. Though the sun shines brightly, Lillian sees a dark time from years long past. She sees her great-grandpa Edmund, now grown. He is owned by another man, forced to pick cotton from daybreak to nightfall, right here in this country, where it is written that all men are created equal. He sure doesn't have the right to vote. In fact, he doesn't have the right to do much at all, until after the Civil War, which will end slavery. As Lillian inches up the hill past one neighbor's house and then the next, she sees her great-grandpa Edmund on his way to vote for the first time, thanks to a law that was passed in 1870. The law is the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says that American citizens' right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or a previous condition of servitude. Even though the law does not allow women to vote, Great-Grandma Ida is with her husband. Lillian feels their dignity and their pride as they enter that courthouse for the first time. Okay, so it took until 1870 with the 15th Amendment to make sure everybody could vote, except still not women, right? Only men could vote at that time. But as Lillian continues and the hill gets steeper, my, that hill is steep, she sees what happens just 20 years later. Right here in Alabama, there's her grandpa Isaac at the courthouse being charged a poll tax to vote, a tax he doesn't have the money to pay. So much for that 15th Amendment. So much for Grandpa Isaac's right to vote. Okay, so Grandpa Isaac was told he had to pay money in order to vote, and he didn't have the money to do it, so they didn't let him vote. Lillian pauses to catch her breath, hearing now the voice of her uncle Levi. He is telling about those tests that he was forced to take when he tried to vote, and about the sneer on the person's face when he asked, "How many bubbles are in a bar of soap?" Her uncle's lips go tight as he recalls being asked to name all 67 judges in the state of Alabama and being turned away when he failed to answer such questions. Do you think we could answer? I couldn't answer that about Colorado, right? And I'm allowed to go vote. So he wasn't allowed to vote because he couldn't answer some questions before voting. As Lillian pushes on, struggling to keep her balance, she sees a brave girl standing next to her mother and father as they try to register to vote. The year is 1920, and the 19th Amendment has just passed, a law allowing women to vote. Took until 1920, right? And for women to be allowed to vote. The girl is Lillian herself with her mama and papa. They are being chased away by an angry mob. There's Mr. Bentley the barber and Mr. McCrory who owns the ice cream shop. She feels the firm grip of her mother's hand as they run through the streets back home. And though today the birds are singing and people are smiling, Lillian sees in vivid orange and brilliant red the cross burning on the lawn of her girlhood home, set aflame by the same angry mob just because her parents wanted to vote. This is something she will always see. Lillian stops in her tracks, unable to keep going. As she stands there, she sees herself trying to register to vote for the very first time. She sees the blank piece of paper on which she must write down a section of the U.S. Constitution, word for word, as it is being mumbled by the registrar, a test she could not pass. No one could. "Are you going to vote?" she asks a young man who passes her on her route. "Yes, ma'am," he answers. "You better," she says, and she means it. For Lillian sees the funeral procession for a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old who was killed by a policeman over nothing more than taking part in a peaceful protest. It is March 1965. All he'd wanted was justice and the right to vote. Looking up to the top of the hill, Lillian wonders how she'll ever make it. It looks so far and she's so tired. Though her feet and legs ache with 100 years of walking, what fuels her ancient body is seeing those 600 people beginning a peaceful protest march from Selma to Montgomery. People who, though they didn't know it yet, will be stopped on a bridge in Selma by policemen with clubs. All they want is justice and the right to vote. At the front is future Congressman John Lewis, whose forehead will always bear a scar from where he was beaten. As long as Lillian still has a pulse, she is going to vote. So she keeps on climbing, keeps on seeing, this time the second march from Selma. This march also ends on the bridge in a prayer led by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose dreams of justice for African Americans are already famous. Wherever he went, he lifted people up with his words, and his words still lift up Lillian, who, seeing the top of the hill, is not about to stop. Footstep by footstep, she keeps on going. Just as the marchers from Selma to Montgomery keep on going through the cold and rain, finally making it all the way to Montgomery on their third march, she sees them all: Martin Luther King, John Lewis, rabbis, priests, and 25,000 other people. Lillian is there. She can still hear Reverend King asking how long they would have to wait for justice. She can still feel the power of his voice when he says, "Not long." And as she takes those final steps to the top of the hill, Lillian can still see how Reverend King was right. She can hear the voice of President Lyndon Johnson on her TV saying to America, "Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. All of us must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." Before Lillian walks through the doors of the building where you better believe she will vote, she looks up and sees the same blue sky, brighter than any sky she's ever seen, that she saw on August 6, 1965. That was the day that President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, the one law protecting all Americans' right to vote. In every state, in every town, one law protecting Lillian as a full-fledged citizen of the United States. She enters the building, and as Lillian steps into the voting booth, once again, she sees herself stepping into the voting booth in 1965 for the very first time. And she knows full well she would not be standing here today were it not for the people who marched and the people who died for her right to vote. Lillian touches her finger to the lever, and because she is a citizen of the United States of America, protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Lillian pushes that lever and Lillian votes. So I hope maybe some of that is new information to you about how the right to vote wasn't always guaranteed to every citizen in our country, and now it is. And as you think about yourself as a voting member in a few years in the United States, how important it is for you to go and vote, because not everybody always had that right, and now you do. Also, take some time, talk to the people around you about what they're voting for, who they're voting for, and why, and if they're choosing to vote, because they have a right to do it, but not everyone chooses to do it. And you can see it was very important to Lillian that she make that choice each year and went to vote. Okay, hope you learned a little, and thanks for listening.